The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. George Bernard Shaw. Better keep yourself clean and bright. You are the window through which you must see the world. George Bernard Shaw. Marriage is an alliance entered into by a man who can't sleep with the window shut, and a woman who can't sleep with the window open. George Bernard Shaw. Related Charles Dickens quotes. The thought of 2,000 people crunching celery at the same time horrified me. George Bernard Shaw. The best place to find God is in a garden. You can dig for him there. George Bernard Shaw. The trouble with her is that she lacks the power of conversation, but not the power of speech. George Bernard Shaw. You have learnt something. That always feels at first as if you have lost something. George Bernard Shaw. Best quotes of George Bernard Shaw. Here is the best collection of Gigabytes Shaw's quotes. His quotes always highly intellectual and knowledgeable. Advertisement. If history repeats itself, and the unexpected always happens, how incapable must man be of learning from experience? George Bernard Shaw. Every man over 40 is a scoundrel. George Bernard Shaw. If women were particular about men's characters, they would never get married at all. George Bernard Shaw. The only service a friend can really render is to keep up your courage by holding up to you a mirror in which you can see a noble image of yourself. George Bernard Shaw. A miracle, my friend, is an event which creates faith. George Bernard Shaw. Like all young men, you greatly exaggerate the difference between one young woman and another. George Bernard Shaw. Liberty means responsibility. That is why most men dread it. George Bernard Shaw. Doing what needs to be done may not make you happy, but it will make you great. George Bernard Shaw. Some look at things that are, and ask why. I dream of things that never were. George Bernard Shaw. Best quotes of George Bernard Shaw. Success does not consist in never making mistakes, but in never making the same one a second time. George Bernard Shaw. Hatred is the coward's revenge for being intimidated. George Bernard Shaw. The golden rule is that there are no golden rules. George Bernard Shaw. Related Handmaid's Tale quotes. The perfect love affair is one which is conducted entirely by post. George Bernard Shaw. We are made wise not by the recollection of our past, but by the responsibility for our future. George Bernard Shaw. When a thing is funny, search it carefully for a hidden truth. George Bernard Shaw. Do not do unto others as you expect they should do unto you. Their tastes may not be the same. George Bernard Shaw. Advertisement. Without art, the crudeness of reality would make the world unbearable. George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw quotes on education. Educate yourself with these educational quotes by Gigabytes Shaw. Definitely you will learn a lot of things from here. Advertisement. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. The being thoroughly worn out before you are thrown on the scrap heap. The being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. George Bernard Shaw. Censorship ends in logical completeness when nobody is allowed to read any books except the books that nobody reads. George Bernard Shaw. You use a glass mirror to see your face. You use works of art to see your soul. George Bernard Shaw. When a stupid man is doing something he is ashamed of, he always declares that it is his duty. George Bernard Shaw. Without art, the crudeness of reality would make the world unbearable. George Bernard Shaw. Do not waste your time on social questions. What is the matter with the poor is poverty. What is the matter with the rich is uselessness. George Bernard Shaw. Both optimists and pessimists contribute to society. The optimist invents the airplane, the pessimist the parachute. George Bernard Shaw. Beware of false knowledge. It is more dangerous than ignorance. George Bernard Shaw. Gigabytes Shaw quotes. The liar's punishment is not in the least that he is not believed, but that he cannot believe anyone else. George Bernard Shaw. Advertisement. If you cannot get rid of the family skeleton, you may as well make it dance. George Bernard Shaw. We have no more right to consume happiness without producing it than to consume wealth without producing it. George Bernard Shaw. I never resist temptation, because I have found that things that are bad for me do not tempt me. George Bernard Shaw. Related Fred Hampton quotes, "What is life but a series of inspired follies? The difficulty is to find them to do. Never lose a chance, it doesn't come every day." George Bernard Shaw. Youth is wasted on the young. George Bernard Shaw. A government that robs Peter to pay Paul can always depend on the support of Paul. George Bernard Shaw. Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. George Bernard Shaw. Gigabytes Shaw quotes about life. Gigabytes Shaw talks more about human life. He gathered a lot of knowledge during his entire life. Hear what he learned from his entire life quoted in lines. Life does not cease to be funny when people die any more than it ceases to be serious when people laugh. George Bernard Shaw. My way of joking is to tell the truth. It's the funniest joke in the world. George Bernard Shaw. A fashion is nothing but an induced epidemic. George Bernard Shaw. Clever and attractive women do not want to vote. They are willing to let men govern as long as they govern men. George Bernard Shaw. Parentage is a very important profession, but no test of fitness for it is ever imposed in the interest of the children. George Bernard Shaw. Advertisement. Choose silence of all virtues, for by it you hear other men's imperfections, and conceal your own. George Bernard Shaw. A fool's brain digests philosophy into folly, science into superstition, and art into pedantry. Hence university education. George Bernard Shaw.